In today's video, we loot through a pile of discount and secondhand toys, and then take the choicest bits and repurpose them as custom wargaming terrain for some upcoming adventures on an angry red planet. Well, hi folks, this is Lee from SkirmishWargames.com. Welcome to the channel. If you've been watching our battle report videos over the last couple of years, and it's quite likely you've seen at least a few of the custom terrain pieces that we've put together. For us, this process usually involves taking some model railroading trees or some discount Christmas diorama trees, along with some toy parts from the bits box, and then assembling them all strategically on some scrap pieces of MDF board. Today, however, we're going to kick things up a notch because I have to admit I have a bit of a problem. I've acquired several tubs worth of new toys and secondhand toy parts that I bought either on clearance or at swap meets or even at the local thrift store because it looked like they might have some terrain building potential. So apparently I'm not the only one who does this. We were talking to a local gaming friend not too long ago, and he said, oh yeah, he's got several tubs full of terrain building stuff too. And we concluded that that's okay as long as those parts eventually come out of the tubs and get used for something. So that's kind of our plan today. We're going to cherry pick some choice discount and secondhand toys from the stockpile and then use them to create some Martian appropriate terrain for a few Mars themed scenarios that we have in the works. So if all goes well, that should give us a few new items to kind of round out this collection of store-bought terrain that we pulled off the shelf because it looked like it might fit into the Mars landscape, and hopefully collectively we'll have enough to build a fairly respectable Martian battlefield. So that's the plan. Let's get to it and see how we do. As I mentioned earlier, we like working with smaller pieces of MDF board when we're building terrain. Now, you can easily buy various sizes of MDF by the stack on places like Amazon, and it's usually not very expensive. However, sometimes you can find a woodworker who's selling his or her MDF end pieces, the scraps, by the flat rate box. That's what these are. They're just leftover end pieces, but for our purposes they work great. Depending on what kind of terrain you're making, you'll probably want to round off the corners and bevel the edges. We have an old belt sander which works really well for beveling the MDF. I think I paid maybe $100 for it 20 years ago, so it's falling apart. The grinding wheel is gone, but it's still kicking. Okay, so wherever this project leads us, we're going to have plenty of MDF panels to work with. Now we just have to dive into our stockpile of plastic parts and find some suitable candidates that we can repurpose as Martian scenery. This somewhat dusty TV camera and dumpster piece here came from a Walt Disney Cars Piston Cup race set, which I think we got at Goodwill for about $14 for the whole thing, so I'm sure there's some gates and buildings and things like that we can cannibalize for Gaslands down the road. So for today, we're going to use this little TV camera for our Martian project, and we'll keep the dumpster in reserve for when we're doing some urban streetscape scenery. And here's a little helicarrier we also got at Goodwill. I think we paid $2.95 for this guy, and I'm not going to use it today, but someday we'll come up with something brilliant to convert it into. And here's a mini plastic train set. That yellow fuel tank, the gray pipes, and these little signs all have potential, but for another day, I think. Okay, here's a small Animal Planet ocean collection that I got on clearance when the local Toys R Us was going through liquidation. And actually I put more than one thing in the cart, but don't judge me because I'm just human. But I did see a few things in here that I thought would make some good alien terrain at some point. So that's why I picked this up. So we're going to attempt to reimagine these pieces of plastic coral as weird Martian plants. And it occurs to me you could achieve almost the same thing by buying used aquarium decorations at a garage sale or something. But this is what we have, so this is what we're going to use. That same Animal Planet Ocean collection also came with a bunch of plastic rocks that we'll keep in mind for future terrain projects. Okay, here's a box of the good stuff here. Most of these are older G.I. Joe toys that came from a tiny little swap meet toy fair that was held locally a couple of years ago. This red escape pod looking thing is actually a G.I. Joe Cobra Pogo Ballistic Battle Ball from about 1987. If these toys were mint in box, they might be worth something, but they were just sold for parts, so we snapped them up. Here's a dusty G.I. Joe laser artillery weapon, which someday I'm going to turn into a tabletop gun emplacement. And for my Happy Meal, here's Jack Jack of The Incredibles. He's destined to become a stone idol for some lost continent civilization. But that's for another day. For today's Martian terrain project, we're going to go with the TV camera, 2 pieces of plastic coral, 1 G.I. Joe Pogo ballistic battle ball, and what looks to be some sort of a G.I. Joe elevated landing pad that we also got from that little toy fair from a couple years ago. Okay, we're going to start by attempting to turn our plastic coral into a pair of weird Martian trees. We'll put each tree on its own MDF base, which will then need to be painted and textured. And at least one base will be embellished with a weird alien skull of some type. I was originally thinking about using this Martian basing material for the MDF, but given the amount of surface area I have to cover, I think I'm going to go with another option. I am, however, going to embellish the boards with these plastic diorama cactuses to serve as baby Martian trees. Okay, I think that's going to work, so now it's time to glue everything down with some green stuff. We let the putty set up overnight, and here's where we're at. That rock there came from a cheap bag of landscaping gravel, so we spared no expense. Now it's time to prep our Pogo battle ball. I need to remove the stickers and also give it a bath to get all the dust off. Plus, this plastic top here isn't going to work for me, so I need to find a replacement. Fortunately, we bought some do-it-yourself clear plastic Christmas ornaments at Michael's after the holidays when they were really cheap, and this half ornament here is going to fit just perfectly on the top of our ballistic battle ball. Okay, so we've disassembled the battle ball and I've washed all the parts, and as I mentioned, I'm going to discard the original windshield and replace it with this 1/2 of a plastic Christmas ornament that I've scuffed up to give the paint some tooth. And with any luck, hopefully, that'll fit right in there and we'll be able to secure it with some super glue, and then when we paint the whole thing, it should look like one seamless dome on top of the lander. Okay, now I'm going to prime the Martian trees with some Rust-Oleum Colonial Red. This stuff sticks to plastic, so it's going to serve as both a primer coat and a base coat. So that gave us pretty good coverage. So now, however I decide to texture the MDF base or paint the trees or the plants or the rocks, we'll have a good foundation of Martian red to build upon. At this stage, I think we're going to keep things pretty simple for this G.I. Joe landing pad and this TV camera. We're just going to clean them up, clip off some extraneous plastic parts, and then give them a quick coat of paint and see how that looks. I wanted to see if I could retain the circle graphic on top of the landing platform, so I just dusted the platform with a little bit of a Rust-Oleum metallic, and I think I will go over it a little bit later with some Nuln Oil and maybe paint the rivets and dry brush some of the hydraulics on the sides. Okay, so here's our reassembled Martian lander with the newly installed bubble top. If you wanted to speed this process along, you could just paint the dome and leave everything else as is, I suppose, but I really want to paint the whole thing. So we're going to give the lander a good coat of Rust-Oleum Apple Red, which kind of reminds me of the Russian Space Agency for some reason. We'll make sure the bubble top and the body get plenty of coverage, and then go a little bit lighter on the legs to make them look a bit shaded. So here's our Martian lander with a fresh coat of paint. We'll allow it to dry in the summer sun for a bit while we move on to some other pieces. So you have several options when texturing your MDF bases. This is just regular old traction sand, like you might keep in the trunk of your car. Here's a coarser grit sand in case you want something a little more rocky. For our Martian project, however, I think I'm going to use this acrylic earth texture. It looks like mud and pretty much is applied the same way. I just sort of dab it on with an old brush and kind of sculpt it as I go until I get the texture that I'm looking for. You can pretty much make it as smooth or as rocky as you want. Alright, now that we've applied the texture to our MDF bases, we'll let that set up a little bit while we work on some other things. It appears that the red base coat is dry on our Martian lander, so now it's time to consider the rest of the paint job. I'm going to put a couple of coats of old gold on the top dome because it reminds me of the Apollo astronaut face shields from back in the space race days. There's the first coat of old gold, and I'm liking the look of that so far, so I'll let that dry a little bit and then come back later and give it a second round. To make this textured earth look a little bit more like Martian soil, I'm going to experiment a little bit and water down this red game ink by about a 4-to-1 ratio. Then I'll just dab it on lightly with a large flat brush until we get a tone that sort of resembles what I think a space opera type Mars surface might look like. Okay, so here's what our textured Earth looks like after we applied the watered down red ink, and just for comparison, here's what it looked like originally. Next, I'm going to dry brush on some orange Riser Rust highlights, and we'll make sure this big Martian rock gets some of those too. I sort of winged it a little bit on painting the trees. I started with some Citadel Screaming Pink, which is actually kind of purple, and some Vallejo Regular Red. Cut them both 50-50 with some white, and then just kind of dry brushed them on the trees. So the end result of that is we have one Martian tree that has a red base coat and violet highlights, and a second one that has a red base coat and pink highlights. So they're each a little bit different. Let's not forget about our snazzy TV camera here. I misted this guy with just a little bit of apple red, letting some of the black show through, and I'll go back and repaint some of the silver sections by hand later. Since the Martian lander here is designed to be a terrain piece, and I want it to look good from 2 to 3 feet away, I'm not at all concerned with tiny details. Instead, I'm going to focus on some key components and try to put some solid colors on there so that when you see them on the tabletop, it's really striking, and some of those different colors cut through the red. So as you can see, I painted the missiles, the springs, I'm going to paint the feet, we're going to get the hoses and the couplings, and a few other little things in here, so that hopefully it looks a little less like something G.I. Joe and Cobra would be fighting over, and more like something Space Marines and Orcs would be fighting over. Though perhaps one could argue that that's not really that big of a distinction. And for the final touches, we're going to throw some Nuln Oil in the creases, sponge on a little smoke around the rocket nozzles, and I think we're pretty close to being complete. And just as a reminder, here's what an original G.I. Joe Cobra Pogo Battle Ball looks like. I think had we given our Martian lander here a base coat color other than red, he would look significantly different than the original G.I. Joe Battle Ball, but I like the red, and it's kind of a throwback to the old Sputnik days, I think. It's actually kind of funny how closely the Rust-Oleum Apple Red matches the original red plastic of the Battle Ball, so that must be a pretty standard shade of red. Okay, just 2 small pieces to finish up here. I think we're going to dry brush on a little metal on parts of our landing pad, paint the rivets, stuff like that. And then on the camera, I'm just going to clean up some of these metallic parts that got a little red splash on them. As I said, I'm going to quickly dry brush on some Iron Hand steel just to make the feet pop a little bit more. Then I took a few minutes to paint all the individual rivets, and I think that was worth it because it looks quite a bit better that way. And to darken up the recessed areas a bit, I threw in a little Nuln Oil because why not? And finally, I repainted the metallic areas on this piston cup TV camera. I'm not sure if he belongs to the Martian Broadcasting Corporation or if he's some sort of mad scientist death ray, but either way, he's ready to go. Well, folks, we hope you enjoyed watching us take some discounted and secondhand toys and repurpose them into tabletop Martian terrain. As I mentioned earlier, we have a couple of Martian-based scenarios in mind, so no doubt you're going to see some of these terrain pieces pop up in a future battle report or two sometime in the very near future. But until then, as always, thank you very much for watching. If you like the things we do here, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please give this video a big thumbs up, and of course, please visit us online at our website, skirmishwargames.com.